Here we are. It's another Wednesday night, and this is White Ash Flies with Colin Mahoney. Thanks for listening. Tonight we're presenting episode 2 of My First Summer in the Sierra by John Muir. You can find older episodes of White Ash Flies on SoundCloud, Spotify, Anchor FM, and on Twitter at Colin Mahoney15. And now, episode 2 of My First Summer in the Sierra by John Muir. On White Ash Flies. June 6th. We are now on what may be called the second bench, or plateau of the range. After making many small ups and downs over belts of hill waves, with, of course, corresponding changes in the vegetation. In open spots, many of the lowland compositae are still to be found, and some of the Mariposa tulips and other conspicuous members of the lily family. But the characteristic blue oak of the foothills is left below, and its place is taken by a fine large species, Quercus californica, with deeply lobed deciduous leaves, picturesquely divided trunk, and broad, massy, finely lobed and mottled head. Here also, at a height of about 2,500 feet, we come to the edge of the great coniferous forest, made up mostly of yellow pine with just a few sugar pines. We are now in the mountains, and they are in us, kindling enthusiasm, making every nerve quiver, filling every pore and cell of us. Our flesh and bone tabernacle seems transparent as glass to the beauty about us, as if truly an inseparable part of it, thrilling with the air and trees, streams and rocks, in the waves of the sun, a part of all nature, neither old nor young, sick nor well, but immortal. Just now I can hardly conceive of any bodily condition dependent on food or breath any more than the ground or the sky. How glorious a conversion, so complete and wholesome it is, scarce memory enough of old bondage days left as a standpoint to view it from. In this newness of life we seem to have been so always. Through a meadow opening in the pine woods, I see snowy peaks about the headwaters of the Merced above Yosemite. How near they seem and how clear their outlines on the blue air, or rather in the blue air, for they seem to be saturated with it. How consuming strong the invitation they extend. Shall I be allowed to go to them? Night and day I'll pray that I may, but it seems too good to be true. Some one worthy will go, able for the godful work. Yet as far as I can, I must drift about these love-monument mountains, glad to be a servant of servants in so holy a wilderness. Found a lovely lily, Calochortus albus, in a shady Adena Stoma thicket near Coulterville, in company with Adiantum chilense. It is white with a faint purplish tinge inside at the base of the petals. A most impressive plant, pure as a snow crystal, one of the plant saints that all must love and be made so much the purer by it every time it is seen. It puts the roughest mountaineer on his good behavior. With this plant, the whole world would seem rich though none other existed. It is not easy to keep on with the camp cloud while such plant people are standing preaching by the wayside. During the afternoon we passed a fine meadow bounded by stately pines, mostly the arrowy yellow pine, with here and there a noble sugar pine, its feathery arms outspread above the spires of its companion species in marked contrast. A glorious tree, its cones 15 to 20 inches long, swinging like tassels at the ends of the branches with superb ornamental effect. Saw some logs of this species at the Greeley mill. They are round and regular as if turned in a lathe, excepting the butt cuts, which have a few buttressing projections. The fragrance of the sugary sap is delicious, and scents the mill and lumber yard. How beautiful the ground beneath this pine, thickly strewn with slender needles and grand cones, and the piles of cone scales, seed wings, and shells around the instep of each tree where the squirrels have been feasting. They get the seeds by cutting off the scales at the base in regular order, following their spiral arrangement, and the 2 seeds at the base of each scale, 100 or 2 in a cone, must make a good meal. The yellow pine cones and those of most other species and genera are held upside down on the ground by the Douglas squirrel, and turned around gradually until stripped, while he sits usually with his back to a tree, probably for safety. Strange to say, he never seems to get himself smeared with gum, not even his paws or whiskers. And how cleanly and beautiful in color the cone litter kitchen middens he makes. We are now approaching the region of clouds and cool streams. Magnificent white cumuli appeared about noon above the Yosemite region, floating fountains refreshing the glorious wilderness, sky mountains in whose pearly hills and dales the streams take their rise, blessing with cooling shadows and rain. No rock landscape is more varied in sculpture, none more delicately modeled than these landscapes of the sky. Domes and peaks rising, swelling, white as finest marble, and firmly outlined. A most impressive manifestation of world building. Every rain cloud, however fleeting, leaves its mark, not only on trees and flowers whose pulses are quickened, and on the replenished streams and lakes, but also on the rocks are its marks engraved whether we can see them or not. I have been examining the curious and influential shrub Adena Stoma Faciaculada, first noticed about Horseshoe Bend. It is very abundant on the lower slopes of the second plateau near Coulterville, forming a dense, almost impenetrable growth that looks dark in the distance. It belongs to the rose family, is about 6 or 8 feet high, has small white flowers in racemes 8 to 12 inches long, round needle-like leaves, and reddish bark that becomes shreddy when old. It grows on sun-beaten slopes, and like grass is often swept away by running fires, but is quickly renewed from the roots. Any trees that may have established themselves in its midst are at length killed by these fires, and this no doubt is the secret of the unbroken character of its broad belts. A few manzanitas, which also rise again from the root after consuming fires, make out to dwell with it, also a few bush compositae, Baccharis and Linoceros, and some liliaceous plants, mostly Calocortis and Brodiae, with deep-set bulbs safe from fire. A multitude of birds and wee, sleekit, cowrin, timorous beasties find good homes in its deepest thickets, and the open bays and lanes that fringe the margins of its main belts offer shelter and food to the deer when winter storms drive them down from their high mountain pastures. A most admirable plant. It is now in bloom, and I like to wear its pretty, fragrant racemes in my buttonhole. Azalea Occidentalis, another charming shrub, grows beside cool streams hereabouts and much higher in the Yosemite region. We found it this evening in bloom a few miles above Greeley's Mill, where we are camped for the night. It is closely related to the rhododendrons, is very showy and fragrant, and everybody must like it not only for itself, but for the shady alders and willows, ferny meadows, and living water associated with it. Another conifer was met today, incense cedar, Libocedrus decurrens, a large tree with warm yellow-green foliage and flat plumes like those of Arbovida, bark cinnamon-colored, and as the boles of the old trees are without limbs, they make striking pillars in the woods where the sun chances to shine on them, a worthy companion of the kingly sugar and yellow pines. I feel strangely attracted to this tree. The brown, close-grained wood, as well as the small, scale-like leaves, is fragrant, and the flat, overlapping plumes would make fine beds, and must shed the rain well. It would be delightful to be storm-bound beneath one of these noble, hospitable, inviting old trees, its broad sheltering arms bent down like a tent, incense rising from the fire made from its dry fallen branches, and a hearty wind chanting overhead. But the weather is calm tonight, and our camp is only a sheep camp. We are near the North Fork of the Merced. The night wind is telling the wonders of the upper mountains, their snow fountains and gardens, forests and groves. Even their topography is in its tones. And the stars, the everlasting sky lilies, how bright they are now that we have climbed above the lowland dust. The horizon is bounded and adorned by a spiry wall of pines, every tree harmoniously related to every other, definite symbols, divine hieroglyphics written with sunbeams. Would I could understand them. The stream flowing past the camp through ferns and lilies and alders makes sweet music to the ear, but the pines marshaled around the edge of the sky make a yet sweeter music to the eye. Divine beauty all. Here I could stay tethered forever with just bread and water, nor would I be lonely. Loved friends and neighbors, as love for everything increased, would seem all the nearer, however many the miles and mountains between us. June 7th. The sheep were sick last night, and many of them are still far from well, hardly able to leave camp, coughing, groaning, looking wretched and pitiful, all from eating the leaves of the blessed azalea. So at least say the shepherd and the dawn. Having had but little grass since they left the plains, they are starving, and so eat anything green they can get. Sheepmen call azalea sheep poison, and wonder what the Creator was thinking about when he made it. So desperately does sheep business blind and degrade, though supposed to have a refining influence in the good old days we read of. The California sheep owner is in haste to get rich, and often does, now that pasturage costs nothing, while the climate is so favorable that no winter food supply, shelter pens, or barns are required. Therefore, large flocks may be kept at slight expense, and large profits realized, the money invested doubling, it is claimed, every other year. This quickly acquired wealth usually creates desire for more. Then indeed the wool is drawn close down over the poor fellow's eyes, dimming or shutting out almost everything worth seeing. As for the shepherd, his case is still worse, especially in winter when he lives alone in a cabin. For, though stimulated at times by hopes of one day owning a flock and getting rich like his boss, he at the same time is likely to be degraded by the life he leads, and seldom reaches the dignity or advantage or disadvantage of ownership. The degradation in his case has for cause one not far to seek. He is solitary most of the year, and solitude to most people seems hard to bear. He seldom has much good mental work or recreation in the way of books. Coming into his dingy hovel cabin at night, stupidly weary, he finds nothing to balance and level his life with the universe. No, after his dull drag all day after the sheep, he must get his supper. He is likely to slight this task and try to satisfy his hunger with whatever comes handy. Perhaps no bread is baked. Then he just makes a few grimy flapjacks in his unwashed frying pan, boils a handful of tea, and perhaps fries a few strips of rusty bacon. Usually there are dried peaches or apples in the cabin, but he hates to be bothered with the cooking of them, just swallows the bacon and flapjacks, and depends on the genial stupefaction of tobacco for the rest. Then to bed, often without removing the clothing worn during the day. Of course his health suffers, reacting on his mind, and seeing nobody for weeks or months, he finally becomes semi-insane or wholly so. The shepherd in Scotland seldom thinks of being anything but a shepherd. He is probably descended from a race of shepherds and inherited a love and aptitude for the business almost as marked as that of his collie. He has but a small flock to look after, sees his family and neighbors, has time for reading in fine weather, and often carries books to the fields with which he may converse with kings. The Oriental shepherd, we read, called his sheep by name. They knew his voice and followed him. The flocks must have been small and easily managed, allowing piping on the hills and ample leisure for reading and thinking. But whatever the blessings of sheep culture in other times and countries, the California shepherd, as far as I've seen or heard, is never quite sane for any considerable time. Of all nature's voices, bah is about all he hears. Even the howls and ki-yees of coyotes might be blessings if well heard, but he hears them only through a blur of mutton and wool, and they do him no good. The sick sheep are getting well, and the shepherd is discoursing on the various poisons lurking in these high pastures, azalea, kalmia, alkali. After crossing the North Fork of the Merced, we turn to the left toward Pilot Peak, and make a considerable ascent on a rocky, brush-covered ridge to Brown's Flat, where, for the first time since leaving the plains, the flock is enjoying plenty of green grass. Mr. Delaney intends to seek a permanent camp somewhere in the neighborhood, to last several weeks. Before noon, we passed Bauer Cave, a delightful marble palace, not dark and dripping, but filled with sunshine, which pours into it through its wide-open mouth facing the south. It has a fine, deep, clear little lake with mossy banks embowered with broad-leaved maples, all underground, wholly unlike anything I have seen in the cave line even in Kentucky, where a large part of the state is honeycombed with caves. This curious specimen of subterranean scenery is located on a belt of marble that is said to extend from the north end of the range to the extreme south. Many other caves occur on the belt, but none like this, as far as I have learned, combining as it does sunny outdoor brightness and vegetation with the crystalline beauty of the underworld. It is claimed by a Frenchman, who has fenced and locked it, placed a boat on the lakelet and seats on the mossy bank under the maple leaves, and charges $1 admission fee. Being on one of the ways to the Yosemite Valley, a good many tourists visit it during the travel months of summer, regarding it as an interesting addition to their Yosemite wonders. Poison oak or poison ivy, Rhus diversiloba, both as a bush and a scrambler up trees and rocks, is common throughout the foothill region up to a height of at least 3,000 feet above the sea. It is somewhat troublesome to most travelers, inflaming the skin and eyes, but blends harmoniously with its companion plants, and many a charming flower leans confidingly upon it for protection and shade. I have oftentimes found the curious twining lily, Strophalerian californicum, climbing its branches, showing no fear but rather congenial companionship. Sheep eat it without apparent ill effects. So do horses to some extent, though not fond of it, and to many persons it is harmless. Like most other things not apparently useful to man, it has few friends, and the blind question, why was it made, goes on and on with never a guess that, first of all, it might have been made for itself. Brown's Flat is a shallow, fertile valley on the top of the divide between the North Fork of the Merced and Bull Creek, commanding magnificent views in every direction. Here, the adventurous pioneer David Brown made his headquarters for many years, dividing his time between gold hunting and bear hunting. Where could lonely hunter find a better solitude? Game in the woods, gold in the rocks, health and exhilaration in the air, while the colors and cloud furniture of the sky are ever inspiring through all sorts of weather. Though sternly practical, like most pioneers, old David seems to have been uncommonly fond of scenery. Mr. Delaney, who knew him well, tells me that he dearly loved to climb to the summit of a commanding ridge, to gaze abroad over the forest to the snow-clad peaks and sources of the rivers, and over the foreground valleys and gulches, to note where miners were at work or claims were abandoned, judging by smoke from cabins and campfires, the sounds of axes, etc. And when a rifle shot was heard, to guess who was the hunter, whether Indian or some poacher on his wide domain. His dog Sandy accompanied him everywhere, and well the little hairy mountaineer knew and loved his master and his master's aims. In deer hunting he had but little to do, trotting behind his master as he slowly made his way through the wood, careful not to step heavily on dry twigs, scanning open spots in the chaparral, where the game loves to feed in the early morning and toward sunset, peering cautiously over ridges as new outlooks were reached, and along the meadowy borders of streams. But when bears were hunted, little Sandy became more important, and it was as a bear hunter that Brown became famous. His hunting method, as described by Mr. Delaney, who had passed many a night with him in his lonely cabin and learned his stories, was simply to go slowly and silently through the best bear pastures, with his dog and rifle and a few pounds of flour, until he found a fresh track, and then follow it to the death, paying no heed to the time required. Wherever the bear went, he followed, led by little Sandy, who had a keen nose and never lost the track, however rocky the ground. When high open points were reached, the likeliest places were carefully scanned. The time of year enabled the hunter to determine approximately where the bear would be found. In the spring and early summer, on open spots about the banks of streams and springy places, eating grass and clover and lupines, or in dry meadows feasting on strawberries. Toward the end of summer, on dry ridges, feasting on manzanita berries, sitting on his haunches, pulling down the laden branches with his paws, and pressing them together so as to get good compact mouthfuls, however much mixed with twigs and leaves. In the Indian summer, beneath the pines, chewing the cones cut off by the squirrels, or occasionally climbing a tree to gnaw and break off the fruitful branches. In late autumn, when acorns are ripe, Bruin's favorite feeding grounds are groves of the California oak and park-like canyon flats. Always the cunning hunter knew where to look, and seldom came upon Bruin unawares. When the hot scent showed the dangerous game was nigh, a long halt was made, and the intricacies of the topography and vegetation leisurely scanned to catch a glimpse of the shaggy wanderer, or at least to determine where he was most likely to be. "Whenever," said the hunter, "I saw a bear before it saw me, I had no trouble in killing it. I just studied the lay of the land and got to leeward of it no matter how far around I had to go, and then worked up to within a few 100 yards or so, at the foot of a tree that I could easily climb, but too small for the bear to climb. Then I looked well to the condition of my rifle, took off my boots so as to climb well if necessary, and waited until the bear turned its side in clear view, when I could make a sure or at least a good shot. In case it showed fight, I climbed out of reach. but bears are slow and awkward with their eyes, and being to leeward of them, they could not scent me, so I often got in a second shot before they noticed the smoke. Usually, however, they run when wounded, and hide in the brush. I let them run a good safe time before I ventured to follow them, and Sandy was pretty sure to find them dead. If not, he barked and drew their attention, and occasionally rushed in for a distracting bite, so that I was able to get to a safe distance for a final shot. Oh yes, bear hunting is safe enough when followed in a safe way, though like every other business it has its accidents, and little Doggy and I have had some close calls. Bears like to keep out of the way of men as a general thing, but if an old, lean, hungry mother with cubs met a man on her own ground, she would, in my opinion, try to catch and eat him. This would be only fair play, anyhow, for we eat them, but nobody hereabout has been used for bear grub that I know of. Brown had left his mountain home ere we arrived, but a considerable number of Digger Indians still linger in their cedar bark huts on the edge of the flat. They were attracted in the first place by the white hunter whom they had learned to respect, and to whom they looked for guidance and protection against their enemies, the Paw Utes, who sometimes made raids across from the east side of the range to plunder the stores of the comparatively feeble diggers and steal their wives.